Well, the escalation that I've been warning about appears to have begun last night, and it's not too surprising, considering that every night there seems to be some small escalation, and that the situation is continually, deteriorating here in the United States. Although the interesting thing is the hotspots seem to be different cities every night. It feels like so long ago that we were just talking about Minneapolis. But last night, even though New York, for multiple nights now, has been, very bad. Not a good situation. Lots of looting, lots of violence. The two places I really want to focus on are Las Vegas and St. Louis. Now, in Las Vegas, a U.S. Marshal was shot and killed. That is the second federal agent who's been shot and killed. The first one was in Oakland last week. In kind of a drive-by shooting type style. Two guys, pulled up in a van and just shot him and drove away. And there seems to be some kind of similar situation here in Vegas to where it was just sort of a hit-and-run type of shooting, not a full battle. Now, in St. Louis, we had what may have been the first battle of the Second American Civil War, in that we had some rioters engaged in a shootout with police. So remember what I've been saying about how, even though people are complaining about how violent the cops are and things, and how the rioters are saying, look at how they treat us, and well, even some of the peaceful protesters, and especially the media's been, nonstop talking about how violent the police have treated them. Well, the police have yet to bring out live ammunition and unleash them on these crowds, and that's a smart thing, because in a lot of countries around the world, when you have civil unrest, a big turning point is when the military or the police opens fire on the crowd and kills unarmed people. But that's only going to continue so long as these people are unarmed. And so as soon as you start seeing armed rioters attacking the police like we saw last night, well then the situation is getting much worse. There will be shooting on the part of the cops. Last night they had to flee because I assume they were only armed with rubber bullets and couldn't take on guys with real guns. Well, now you're going to see more cops with real guns, and they're going to be ready to open fire on people who shoot at them. And when they do that, there's probably going to be unarmed people around them. So if the cops sprays a few bullets in the direction of a guy who was shooting at him, he's probably going to hit some unarmed people. And so that will be the next step, but we're getting closer and closer to that because the guns are going to come out now, and that's certainly the case on the civilian side. I said either the escalation is going to occur when the rioters start getting shot by the police or by civilians who are defending private property. Well, we saw yesterday in Miami videos of private individuals protecting businesses there, standing guard with their guns, which I'm glad to see. There are videos all over Twitter of one was an Arab business owner in New York shooting at some looters and shouting at them in Arabic. Then you also had roof Arabs, which was interesting. Arab businessmen in the Northeast, standing on their rooftops, walking around with AKs, kind of like the roof Koreans back during the LA riots. Glad to see that. We saw an Asian, probably not a Korean, but just for the meme's sake, you'd like to think it was a Korean, shouting at pointing a gun at a looter that he had subdued and had on the ground, and was shouting at him like, "Hey, did you smash my windows? You piece of trash," and all things like that. And then of course there was the Noble gun shop owner in Philadelphia who shot a looter, which would have been very bad had the looters gotten in and stolen a bunch of guns, because then the situation would have gotten a lot worse very quickly, because then all of a sudden you would have had a bunch of armed looters. But thankfully he shot the first guy that came through the door and put a stop to that. But this is only going to happen more and more. Once we start seeing the signs of this, it's just going to pick up and gain steam. Especially since now President Trump has called out the U.S. military, or is at least threatening to, because he's rightfully pretty tired of seeing this on TV, and says the local governments have lost control, Well, in the American system, it's I guess everyone might not know this, but it's a pretty unique and important feature of the American government that the military is not allowed to enforce domestic laws. There's supposed to be a very clear schism between domestic and foreign I guess enforcers, you could say. The military is only supposed to crack the skulls of foreigners, and the police are only supposed to crack the skulls of Americans. So, and that's a check so that if the police lose control of the situation, I guess the founders had in mind that, well, if the police can't quell the civilians, then they've lost the consent of the governed, and so therefore, whoever the rioters are should take over. That's generally the rationale, so that you don't have, so that it's a check on a tyrannical government trying to prevent them from using the military to crack down on civilians. Well, during the Civil War, famously, Abe Lincoln ignored that and said, "Nope, I'm going to use the military domestically," and he had some legalese to get around it. And so that tells me that that Trump has something similar in mind. That posse comitatus, is only applies when when the president doesn't want to use the military, which is a nice way of saying that we never really had posse comitatus to begin with. Now people are understandably very upset about this, but what do they expect? I've been trying to warn the left about this last week. That hey, if you cheer on this violence and you get more of it, don't come crying to me when we end up with 40 years of Francisco Franco, because Franco came to power specifically because ordinary Spaniards were tired of the left-wing mob, just destroying things and hurting innocent people. Franco's job was to bring order to society, and frankly, I would argue that he didn't really do that. If you look a little closely, he carried out his own campaign of terrorism. But nevertheless, he was a reaction to the left-wing mob. So if you're, and I'm sure none of these Antifa people are fans of Franco. Well, if you don't want that to happen here in America, if you don't want the military in the streets, then you can't provoke them like this. You need to understand, the psychology of the U.S. government, and that, they will come out and start doing some pretty nasty things before they let you just overthrow them. But of course, with the military out in the streets, the escalation will only continue, because the military isn't going out there armed with rubber bullets. I'll tell you that. If the military's out there and rioters come and attack them, they're going to shoot to kill, because that's what they do. And a lot of people have questioned, well, come on, could the U.S. military really fire on Americans? They're always trained to shoot at people who've been dehumanized, like Arabs, Afghans, things like that. People who, they just kind of have to preserve their sanity, not think of as people. And don't you think that if the U.S. military was sent into the streets to kill Americans, that they could, that just wouldn't happen? That they would either desert or defect or something like that? Well, frankly, no, not in this situation. Because I don't think that many folks in the military would look at rioters destroying America as people. I think they would see them just the same way as they saw terrorists in Iraq after 9/11, even though the people in Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. They would see them as enemies of humanity. And so I think it's very possible that the U.S. military would open fire on civilians who are rioting. I do, just to clarify though, think that there would be some defections from the military if, say, this was a situation where there were truly peaceful protesters. Let's say that there's some big, gun confiscation bill that is passed, and people, are out in the streets, with their guns, showing, hey, we're not going to give up our guns. And then the president orders the military to shoot all the gun owners. I don't think that would happen. Because those people would be seen, the military would be able to relate to them, because, well, I mean, the elephant in the room here is that the military is generally made up of, right-wing people. So, all in all, the military gets on the streets, that's going to be bad news for the left. And so once the blood is spilled, once the military has, gotten into conflicts with people, those on the left who support these protests, you're going to see more people out in the streets after that, I think, because they will feel emboldened. Because they will see that and it will confirm everything they believe, because they will see the U.S. military gunning down Americans and say, hey, this is what tyranny looks like. And, they have a decent point, but, in principle, but, or in general maybe, but, they're obviously very misguided in my opinion. Now, an update on something else I've mentioned is the possibility that the looters just get tired and go home, which is what, typically kind of will happen in these situations. And, of course, I have not seen that yet either. It seems like all the riots are still going good and strong. Maybe that's because, I'm looking at different cities every night, so maybe not the same cities are, burning themselves night after night, except for New York and Chicago. But overall, there's still plenty of violence to go around. And, violence that is, as I've been talking about, becoming more and more severe. But still, not to where I would call this Civil War II yet. I still think that these steps that I've been talking about, bullets flying back and forth, that needs to happen before we're in full Civil War. And that needs to happen not just once or twice. It needs to be a sustained feature of this era. We will need, repeated battles in the streets between authorities or citizens and the rioters. That's when I think it'll be safe to say that you have your Civil War. So with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.